Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Uspamanda Mhlongo, and I welcome you on behalf of the Democracy Development Program to this political summit that we're hosting in regards to restoring public trust. And essentially what we want to try and talk about is how do we create a more robust and active participatory politics, particularly in relation to the sharp decline in trust that we were experiencing in government. It's essentially serving to undermine or rather underline that trust is an essential yet often overlooked ingredient in successful policymaking. Without trust in governments, markets, and institutions, support for necessary reforms is difficult to mobilize, particularly where short-term sacrifices are involved and long-term gains might be tangible. What we do note is that whilst this summit was planned well ahead of the past couple of weeks and the recent unrest that we experienced, particularly in Gauteng and KwaZulu Natal, and then some of the unrest that's happening within the taxi industry in the Western Cape. We do think it's actually quite a timeless engagement. It's one that is necessary at this point in time, particularly when we talk about the restoration of public trust, the institutions that serve communities and serve us as people who work and breathe civil society and community development means that we have to adjust our thinking and adjust the ways in which we engage with institutions quite significantly. And so there are a number of speakers that we have with us who will be able to talk to that. We do have some political parties that will be part of the engagement as well as yourselves. We do encourage everyone to please keep their mics and cameras off unless they are prompted to speak, just so that we can ensure that we have a quality recording. We also would like to extend some apology to everyone. I know that the Zoom link had indicated 8:30, but we are starting at 9 a.m. and which is now. If you've been waiting in our waiting room, we do want to thank you for your patience. We will be starting promptly. But of course, in order to welcome you with the appropriate level of vigor, I'd like to welcome our Executive Director, Dr. Paul Kariuki, to just give a brief background to part of why we formed this political summit and essentially why we chose this specific subject matter, as well as welcome you to participate and be involved in the space. Thank you very much, Dr. Kariuki.
Thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate it very much. And thank you to all of you who have made time to join us this morning. We're very honored to have our guest speakers on board. Thank you again, Sai, Denis, and Colette for accepting our invitation to facilitate the conversations together with us. And for all of you who have also joined as our partners and political parties who support the work of the organization as far as enhancing civic education and understanding why political parties matter in a democracy. And of course, to say a special welcome to our former director, Dr. Rama Naidu, on whose shoulders DDP do stand today. I really acknowledge you and thank you so much, sir, for coming through. And for all the political parties, again, for your ongoing support. As my colleague Brian has shared, the DDP's work is very much linked to ongoing civic education and enhancing of for citizens' understanding of the role that political parties play in strengthening and consolidating democracy in our nation. And this is our fourth year in convening this summit. And each year, different aspects linked to our political party systems, our electoral participation, and the role of civil society and ordinary citizens in ensuring that our democracy is not threatened, it is strengthened, and is upheld and sustained even for the future generations to come long after we've gone. They can stand on a foundation that we created and co-created an opportunity for them to dream a future that is possible. We understand that this, as my colleague has just said, We are hosting this summit at a very pivotal time in our history in our country, given the last week's mayhem that really went to the core of our democracy, threatening the very peace, the very social cohesion that we have built over years, collectively as a people, collectively as political parties, and collectively as ordinary citizens working together to ensure that we do not go back to where we came from pre-1994. They were unfortunate happenings, and we think by creating this opportunity, we're going to unpack some of those things through the conversation that we're going to have, and trying to get to a place of forging a way forward, of rebuilding broken relationships and create pathways for healing from the community level way up to the top. At the same time, also underscoring the responsibilities that each constituency represented here on this platform do have to play towards that process of rebuilding, rehealing, and restoration. And therefore, on behalf of the DDP team, the DDP board, and our founder, Conrad Nduma Stiftung, I do welcome you, and I wish us fruitful deliberations in the next 2 hours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kariuki, for that welcome. I think it's also quite important to make certain that we as a Democracy Development Program are open to hearing your thoughts and views on as many interventions we can try and host in relation to restoring the trust between citizens as well, because quite a lot of the work of community building is around how do we ensure that citizens are able to live meaningfully beside and with each other towards a more prosperous future, whatever that future that they imagine for themselves might be. Of course, part of the work that we engaged with is a continued partnership with the Independent Electoral Commission for a variety of interventions that we've been able to host together. But I'd like to welcome, for the purposes of the opening address, which forms the anchor of today's engagement, the Chief Electoral Officer, Mr. Mamabolo, to give us his presentation in relation to the subject matter that we're talking to today. Of course, Mr. Mamabolo is unfortunately engaged in other matters. As we saw in the past couple of days, there has been a release of a report from the Musenege inquiry relating to the viability of hosting elections at the end of this year. And we do see that the recommendation has been that we would be in a better position to access a more free and fair election process based on the information that we've received in relation to COVID-19, at least by February next year. So we would like for you, if you have any questions in relation to the presentation from Mr. Mamabolo, to please note them down, put them in a chat section, or raise your hand towards the end of his presentation so that we're able to engage him quickly before he has unfortunately to leave us for other engagements. And we do acknowledge both the partnership with the IEC, but also Mr. Mamabolo specifically for his willingness to contribute to the work of the Democracy Development Program. Mr. Mamabolo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Spamandla, and greetings to Paul and the staff from DDP. It's always a pleasure for me to join you in your engagements. I find them pertinent, I find them relevant, and fulfilling in many ways. So it is always a great pleasure on my part to be part of this family. So I'm really happy to be part of the session this morning. And may I extend greeting to my fellow presenters, Dr. Schultz, Professor Gumete, a long friend, Denis Kadima, and I see that we're going to be having a representative of political parties as well. Thank you. Now, I think I've been given a very difficult topic to deal with, especially coming from an elections management body, because an election management body is constrained constitutionally to continue to remain on an impartial path. So I do not want, therefore, to venture into the assessment of governance. I think that is for academics and political commentators to deal with. What I sought to do to approach the question by looking at what the views of the public are in relation to public trust and the electoral process, and therefore the implication of that for their likely participation in the elections. And I propose to enter the presentation by using two longitudinal studies. One, what we call the voter participation surveys that we do ahead of an election. But just don't look at one, look at what they mean over a period of time and what is the sentiment from one election to the other. I think that gives us a basis of evaluating the topic on a longitudinal basis. But I'll supplement this by the South African Social Attitude Survey of the Human Sciences Research Council, because they too are dealing with the indices that have a bearing on the topic that we are to deal with. And in so doing, it will address the core of the questions before us today without putting me into a party political space, whether positive or antagonistic. That said, I think it's important that we start with a conceptual overview. And Pippa Norris, in a book, Democratic Deficit, the Critical Citizens Revisited, gives us a conceptual overview of looking at a number of indicators related to political trust and political support. And Pippa Norris says that at the periphery of a political system are national identities. And national identities essentially refer to feelings of patriotism and national pride. And beneath that, from the periphery, as you go inward of the political system, you have approval of core values, principles of that political system. Often these are matters that are dealt with in the Constitution, the core values and principles underpinning a political system. And as you go deeper into that system, then comes the evaluations of the performance of the regime, whichever regime is in office. And as you draw in is the strength, or rather the evaluation of the confidence in the institutions of the state, the courts, parliament, electoral institutions, etc., etc. In other words, those important institutions of democracy in a political system, what is the confidence level that people have of that. But on the inner level, at the inner level is the approval ratings of incumbent office bearers. In other words, the positive evaluations of the honesty and probity and responsiveness of those in office. Approval ratings of the president, ministers, councillors, premiers, etc., etc., etc. So people notice then gives us this as a conceptual framework really to analyze the continued engagement of people in the democratic project. So if we go along and start with the outer issue about the feeling of patriotism and national pride, I'm only going to be presenting the results of the surveys that I've spoken about insofar as they relate to the province of KwaZulu-Natal. I will be talking slightly about its comparison with the national average, just to see where is the province in relation to the rest of the country. But the major focus will be on KwaZulu-Natal. Now, before you, it's a slide that asked the question. And this is from the Human Sciences Research Council's social attitudes survey over time. Not just for a point of orientation, the red line, it's the lower end of the whole country. And then on top is the green color line, is the upper end of the national score, if you want to call it that. And then the gray is the national average. And then the yellow, it's the KwaZulu-Natal score. So this tracks the sentiment on patriotism, national pride, people answering the question in a survey. I would rather be a citizen of South Africa than of any other country in the world. What is the percentage agreement? And this, you'll see that in 2003, the national average was just above 80%. And then it moves up by 2005, just under 88% or so. Then drops in 2008 to just over 80%. And so it fluctuates. KwaZulu-Natal, which is the yellow line, remains above the national average of 80% until after 2011, where it dips between 2011 and 2013, and remains above the national average, hitting 90% in 2016, and then declines almost at the same rate as the national average from 2016 to 2018. Now, what this appears to tell us is that national sentiment and a sense of patriotism is not constant over time. It fluctuates. That's the first point. But it remains relatively high on average. The national indicator for national pride remains relatively high, above 80%. And KwaZulu-Natal's is, in fact, for most part, between 2003 and 2018, is above the national average. So there's a deep sense of patriotism in the country based on the results of these horizontal and longitudinal surveys. Now, if one moves to the question of the satisfaction with the manner in which democracy is working in South Africa, again, tracking it from 2003 to 2018. Here are the results from the surveys. One, there's been a general decline in the satisfaction with the functioning of democracy among KwaZulu-Natal residents since 2014, largely mirroring the national trends. There was a favorable upswing between 2008 and 2012, but this development was relatively short-lived, and a decline again occurred between 2012 and 2013, followed by a fluctuating tendency between 2013 and 2016. In 2017, satisfaction reached a low point of 23%, though there was a slight recovery by late 2018 when satisfaction rose to 27%. Relative to other provinces, KZN residents tend to be fairly critical of the way democracy is working, ranking in the bottom half for most part of the period between 2003 and 2018. So you can see that, again, the same color scheme applies throughout the graphs that I'm going to be presenting to yourselves. That satisfaction in KZN hit bottom low in 2006, and again in 2017. In 2006, in fact, it was the very tail end of the national range. And relative to the national pride and patriotism, our satisfaction score is much lower generally. The best we've been able to get to as a country is in 2004 at about 60%, whereas national pride, we're hovering just under 90%. So in a sense, the sentiment about from people who have been surveyed is that we have to be concerned about the view they hold that the way democracy is working in South Africa, they are not satisfied. And this is true for most part of 2003 to 2018. Perhaps I should have added that at the beginning, that these are national surveys. And they are representative, done out of a representative sample. I'll get you towards the end the precise numbers of people surveyed, just to close for completeness. but is a representative sample of the South African Social Attitude Survey on the one hand, and the Voter Participation Survey on the other. Now, we asked the question about how democracy is working, and then we asked a different question, or rather the survey asked a different question. Is the country going in the right direction? In late 2010, 55% of the adult population of KZN indicated that the nation was heading in the right direction. Despite fluctuations in this outlook in recent, there's been a sustained general downward pattern during the decade, reaching a low point in 2012. Sorry, or a low point of 12% by 2018. Although the trend in the province reflects the national tendency of reduced confidence in the country's direction, the province did not display the slight improvement between 2017 and 18, which was observed in the rest of the country. In 2018, KwaZulu-Natal represented the first occasion that the province fell below the national average. And the average provincial ranking across these periods was 4th out of 9 provinces. But this fell to 9th, in other words, the lowest in 2018, which means while the rest of the country felt a little positive about the direction the country was taking, the sentiment in KwaZulu-Natal remained circumspect in 2018. Now, whether this will alter in coming years, it is something that we need to be monitoring. Normally, we do these types of survey ahead of an election, and we go into the field again shortly to look at what the situation is, and we'll then build that result into this longitudinal lines, so that to create a more current situation. I think the point that really I want to mention was that there was a bulge there in 2012 where KZN was way above the national average, but from about 2017 right through to 2018, you can see that KwaZulu-Natal dips down and goes below the national average. So, in a sense, people in the province still believe that the country is not going in the right direction, or at least a majority of people in the province. Now, there are certain democratic, about 6 democratic ideals that we also checked through the HSRC social attitude survey. And this democratic ideals are measured on a score of 0 to 10. And here are the outcomes. And on average, free and fair elections received the most favorable rating, followed by the belief that our democracy offers viable opposition, freedom of expression, and allows participation in protest. So each one of these democratic ideals. I'll go into them into a little bit of detail shortly. Spamandla, can you just give me an indication of time, because you handed over later than the program indicated, so I just want to get a sense of how much time I have.
About 5 more minutes, Mr. Mamabolo.
Only?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Okay, we'll look into these democratic ideals, but there are certain important slides that I think it will be an injustice if I didn't go through them.
Yeah.
Given
no, it's okay. You can try as much as possible.
Yeah, thanks, but I really appreciate that. And residents of KZN are less convinced that elected officials listen to the public, or that there is electoral accountability. By electoral accountability, we mean that parties are punished during elections for poor performance during the previous term. That's really, in political science, how the word electoral accountability is used. Now, over 2013 and 18 period, evaluations of the supply of the five of the 6 democratic ideals improved, but a drop is evident for free and fair elections. I think this one is going to make me lose my job, where the democratic ideals, all other democratic ideals are showing an improvement, except for one on free and fair election. So obviously there is a trend that we now need to monitor closely across the province, but as well as on a national basis. Now, let's just look at this one. The first one, the first democratic ideal, free and fair elections. What is the sentiment? And this is on a scale of 1 to 10. KwaZulu-Natal, the country generally hovers just above the score of 7 and declines to about 6.8, 6.9. But KwaZulu-Natal is consistently below the national average, which is just above the score of 6, on their belief that our political system offers a free and fair election. Now, on whether elected officials listen to the public, KwaZulu-Natal starts in 2013 below the national average to about 2015. From then on, it goes above the national average and maintains that at about 50%. In other words, at the midway point of 5, over a score of 5. The national average by 2019 is below half, it's below the midway point at about 4.6, thereabout. Electoral accountability mirrors the same element. KwaZulu-Natal, from about 2015 or so, goes up and is above the national average, which is almost a consistent straight line of a score of 4.7. So KwaZulu-Natal, although I mean, it's at half, people believing that there is electoral accountability. In other words, if you take office and you don't perform well, you'll be punished at the next election. That score remains, even at a high point of 5, it's half. So the score is very, in general, the evaluation of electoral accountability in our political system remains quite low. Then I won't deal with public protest and freedom of expression. I think I'll avail those slides so that you can share. Satisfaction with municipal performance, very important given that we're talking municipal elections. In 2010, there was general discontentment with the performance of municipalities among the KZN public. The share that was satisfied with municipal functioning fell from 43% in 2010 to 19% in 2013. This recovered to 28% by 2015 and declined again to 22% in 2018. With the exception of 2013, KwaZulu Natal figures approximate the national average. And okay, let's get to it. And this tells a very different story if you look at the curve. If you look at the green line, the green curve, in 2013, the satisfaction with municipal performance was above 50%, probably 50, 53, 54, 54%. And then it declines. Whereas in KwaZulu Natal, there's a big dip there in 2013. And then there's a steady increase from then until 2015, where it aligns with national sentiment of satisfaction with municipal performance. So that period of 2010 to 2013 really was a period of deep concern in the province, which has shown a slight improvement. But again, the rating is very low at the national average of 38%, which is what is relative also true for the province, just above the 30% mark. So that's really the current, I mean, in 2018, that's really the current rating of municipal performance in the province from this surveys. Now, this one I can't not talk about because you'll say I talk about other people's issues, I forget about mine. In late 2018, about half, 49% of KwaZulu Natal public expressed trust in the Electoral Commission. This is the lowest recorded level of trust in the Commission in the province over the period, 2003 to 2018. After a period of relatively high trust between 2006 and 2010, a significant decline was observed between 2010 and 2013. Although this recovered somewhat between 2013 and 20, it was followed by another substantial drop over the period 2016 and 2018. In many respects, the provincial pattern mirrors the national trend over time, with higher than average trust levels between 2006 and 2012 and 2016 and 17. Compared to other provinces, KZN ranked fourth on aggregate in terms of trust in the Commission across the full period, and has been in the top 4 in 11 of the 17 years examined. We believe that trust in the Commission is influenced by the general views on democracy, and despite fluctuations, remains one of the most trusted institutions in the country. Let's look at this. You'll see that the scores that I've been presenting to you, most of them are below 50%. Now, when it comes to the Commission, let's just look at the national average first. We're peaking at just under 70% between in 2004 and 2009, and between 2009 and 10, and again in 2016. So this says is that in the lead up to elections, our score goes up. And then in the period after the election, the score comes down until the next election. You see, in 2015, that was preparation for the 2016 elections. The only area where this phenomenon did not obtain was ahead of the 2014 election. So what this really says is that we tend to score better when we are on the ground and doing work on the ground and so on ahead of an election. In between elections, there's a general decline, except in two cases, as you see here, 2000 in the 2014 elections and in the 29 election. For KZN, trust in the commission was high ahead of the 2006 election, and it remains there and goes up at the time of the 2009 election slightly until 2010. And from then there's a decline of about 50% and then a slight increase from then on. So the challenge is not only for other institutions in government, in the state, but it's also a challenge for the Electoral Commission as well. Trust in the courts, I want to skip this because of time. You can look at that. Trust in political parties, there are political parties here. It's only fair that we give them a sense of what the view is from this service. And I'll finish in the next 5 minutes, Pamandla. Data from reveal that trust in political parties remained low over the period, averaging 24%. In 2008, 2010, 2016, and 2017 in particular, an increase in trust in political parties were noticed, but for most of the period, under assessment, KwaZulu Natal residents were less trusting than the national average. In terms of provincial ranking, KwaZulu Natal ranked 7th, and the province was in the bottom half in all years of observation, apart from 2010, 13, 16, and 17. Of particular note is the change between 2017 and 18, where a lack of upswing in trust compared with other provinces resulted in the provincial ranking of KZN falling from 2nd to 9th. In other words, last. So from 2005 until 2010, KwaZulu-Natal is under the national average, and then just above the national average in 2010, and then declines until 2014, and there's an uptake between 2014 and 2016. And then after 2017, it goes down to basically the lower point of the lower band of the tracking. So that's what the province is saying, the people in the province are saying about the trust in political parties. Let me leave you with this. Traditional trust in traditional authorities is much higher than it is ranking in the 60 percentile. So the institution of traditional leadership is still highly trusted in comparison with political parties and but not as high as that of the Electoral Commission, because the Electoral Commission you've seen is in the 70% percentile. I want religious leaders, the very high. So this institution is trusted highly in society. At a point, at the top end, at about 85% approval rating. But it's true, as in years where there's a decline in other institutions, this institution also has gone down. So one can say, as a general observation, that disgruntlement with political institutions, especially since 2008, seems to have spilled over to other socio-cultural institutions and has even impacted religious institutions, which have historically been trusted institutions in our society. Then public interest in South African electoral politics. This is important. Are people still interested in South Africa's electoral politics? It is apparent that the majority of KwaZulu-Natal residents reported an interest in elections. In late 2005, slightly more than 4/5 indicated a fair level of interest in government elections. And looking at how levels of interest change over time, we find that this picture has remained relatively stable between 2005 and 2010, but thereafter there's been a steady decline. The share indicating that they are interested in government elections fell from a whopping 82 to 51% in 2018. So there is a dramatic decrease in electoral politics. And KZN mirrors the national results, but registers a higher than average decline since 2018. The gap between provincial and national averages was 10% point in that South African social attitude survey. And KwaZulu-Natal on average ranked 4th over the duration. So interest therefore starts at high at 8%, and over time, in 2008, then we get under the national average in KZN at about 72 thereabout percent, and then goes above the national average in 2010 to just over 80%, and then declines, mirroring national average until 2013, where from then increases to just under 80% in 2015. But from about 2018, it has dropped to just under 60%. Do people still believe in the power of one's vote? Yes, there's a decline of the people's belief in the power of one's vote, especially between 2006 and 2010, by 25 percentage points. But as a greater share, 61% of KZN residents in late 20 thought that their vote could make a difference than what was observed in 2013. So thereafter, we have witnessed a decline in public agreement on this issue. And in 2018, only 40% of KZN agreed with the statement that they have believed that they believe in the power of their vote. So it's a very truncated situation, a very different curve from the rest that we've seen this morning. there must be other factors that we need to probe that influences this, because there has to be underlying factors that influence this belief, because you can see how sharp the fluctuations are in comparison with the other caps. So, dear Chairperson, I want to leave it at that. It is my sincere hope that I have given the session some sense of what the people in the province are saying with regard to public trust, and how that influences their political behavior, be it in the elections and in other processes, as well as civic participation. I really thank you for your audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mamabolo, for that presentation. I think it will lead very well into the other conversations that we're going to have. But more than that, I think it has some interesting trends that have been highlighted by the various reports that you've cited. We would like to request, if you have a question, that you please raise your hand. If you are unable to do so, you may do as Uzamuhle Mbandwa has indicated here on the chat section, where he's indicated that he has a question. But whilst Zamuhle, you may unmute yourself, and then you can engage us, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Can you hear me that side?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you, Mr. Mamabolo, for a very well-informed presentation. However, I do have a question. My question is one, but it is divided into two. I thank you for actually presenting a well-informed section of national pride. However, I have an interest on who are the respondents of the study. Was it based on the findings of the upper class or the lower class citizens? And then I want to know, since he's with us here, what will happen in the interim while the elections has been postponed to not later than February next year? And lastly, I would also want to know if maybe they actually have a plan to make some amendments in the electoral system that we have in South Africa, because seemingly it seems that the electoral system have failed the people of South Africa, because most people that are voting, especially on the ground level, do not vote for leaders that they choose, but they vote for leaders that has been elected by the political parties. And they are left with no choice, because they have some significant relationship with political parties, which then explain why they vote for those political parties. But they primarily do not have an input on who must be elected. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mbandwa, for those three questions. Mr. Mamabolo, perhaps if you can respond to them as they are still fresh. The first one being, if you can give us an idea of the sample size, the stratification between class in that sample, I assume class, race, and age, and as some of those considerations that would have gone into the study itself. The second part being, what's the process going forward based on the presentation that was given by the IEC and the former Justice Moseneke on the work of the IEC in particular as it relates to local government elections, and then thirdly, what work is being done either to shift the way in which the current political or electoral system is working, particularly as it relates to the proportional representation aspect of it, because essentially we're left where we are because of the choice of electoral system that we went into as it relates to proportional representation, where political parties have a list of people that they deploy based on the proportion of the vote that they get at national elections in particular. Mr. Mamabolo, if you could respond to those three questions.
Let me start with the last of the three questions. The electoral system for local government has an element of constituency. You'll recall that it distributes the seats in council into two halves. One, it's a PR component, 50%, and a ward component, 50%. Therefore, it's a mixed member proportional system, which allows for direct election of ward councillors. But given what I've presented this morning, it is evident that, and especially on issues of municipal performance, it is evident that even that level of accountability is not a panacea to how to municipal performance. That level of direct election in ward councillors does not give people a better municipal performance outcomes, at least insofar as these surveys go. So we have to find out through proper research, what is it in local government that creates the perceptions and the reality that it is not working well, because it is having a direct election component. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. The second point is, indeed, in national and provincial election, it's a pure proportional representation system based on closed party lists. And I'm aware that Parliament is seized with that issue because you'll recall last year in June, 14 June, the Concord said the Electoral Act is incompatible with the Constitution to the extent that it does not allow independent candidates. So that matter is being looked at the Parliament level. It's not the IC who drives it. The IC obviously has an interest in the issue, and we are making submissions to the extent that, or rather we are assisting to the extent that we have expertise, but it is not an IC-driven issue. It's a parliamentary-driven issue, even in terms of the decision of the Constitutional Court. Now, the penultimate question is, what will happen with, in the meantime, following the Mseneke report? First things first, the Commission will tomorrow announce a raft of measures it will undertake as consequential steps to the publishing of the report. So if you just bear with us until tomorrow to finalize the consideration of the report and the actions that now have to be undertaken flowing from the report. The size, or rather the demographic and composition of this, it's a nationally representative sample, SLMs 1 to 10, so that it speaks to the attitudes of all South African voters. So it breaks people into metropolitan areas, people who live in district councils, areas, people in deep rural areas and so on. The sample size approximately for the voter participation survey, for which we are responsible. The sample size is about 3,000. And then it's supplemented for adjusting purposes with focus groups of 100 people, where there's, once we have the outcomes, where you engage people to create more understanding of the issues that arise. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Mamabolo, for your responses. Recognizing that you are limited in terms of time as well, I'll ask this last question from the chat section from Mr. Khambule. We do note the question from Omololu, but I would like to advise that that question will probably suit one of our other panelists and even some of the political parties a bit better. But Mr. Khambule asks, in 2019, we saw less than 50% of the electorate, or at least the eligible voters voting. What is the IEC doing to encourage voting, to improve this figure and support the legitimacy of government? I think if you can maybe use that as an important, or as a closing remark, as part of your closing remarks, and then we can leave you to sort out tomorrow's arrangements as we wait eagerly for the decision of the IEC.
Yeah. No, thanks very much, Pamela. Look, let's start off by saying, Mr. Pillay, participation in an election, it's a consequence of a confluence of factors. Some related to the quality of governance, some related to perceived or real service delivery and quality thereof, some related to people's access to knowledge about political processes. The IEC comes in at that third component. And to that extent, we're doing radio programming, voter education radio programming, because we can't do face-to-face sessions. We're doing voter education, short animated videos for social media to talk to young persons. We are driving, well, we have had to jettison our communication campaign, but we have a huge communication campaign to support the registration effort. We've just introduced an online registration platform so that young persons and those that have data can register online without having to visit a voting station. And there are other forms of engagements that we do, and so on and so on and so on. But I just wanted to make a point that, you know, the level of people's participation is not within the exclusive province of the Electoral Commission. It also has to relate with people's experiences of how governance impacts on their lives and those related questions. We will do our part as we should in terms of our role in law. We will never stop doing community engagement, and we are committed. We are committed to that. But voting is not compulsory in South Africa, and there are other factors that influence people's participation. Thank you very much, Pamanda. And I really wish to thank you all for your audience, and I want to thank my fellow presenters really for having listened to me, Denis, and Dr. Schultz, and all representatives of political parties. I would have loved to stay in the program and engage some more. Regrettably, I am unable to.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mamabolo, for your commitment to the process, particularly given the new interventions that you will have to be a part of, and your commitment to the process insofar as supporting the partnership with civil society. I think that's an important role that the IEC plays as part of its work in promoting an accessible democracy, a democracy in which all key stakeholders have the opportunity and the ability to play a role in that space. So thank you very much for being a part of our, and we wish you and the rest of the team back at the IEC all the best in whatever processes you're going to start instituting from now until when that date is out. Of course, we do ask that everyone, as well as we keep in mind that COVID-19 is still a significant part of our lives, that we try as much as possible to keep within the relevant regulations. Thank you very much, Mr. Mamabolo. I will now ask that we move on to our next session, where we have two key representatives and presenters. And of course, the presentation from Mr. Mamabolo helps ground part of these discussions that we're going to have. And we're going to be having a presentation firstly from Dr. Colette Scholes-Hezenberg, who is part of the Stellenbosch University's political science department. She has a BA in politics from London, an MSc in democratic governance from UCT, and has a PhD in politics as well from the University of Cape Town. She's a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, again at Stellenbosch, and she'll be talking to us about the average South African voter, the motivations, the push and pull factors as to why certain participation levels will be in place. And we want to thank her again for her willingness to participate in the process, and we look forward to her presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Scholes-Hezenberg.
Thank you so much, Pamandla, for that warm welcome. It's very good to be with you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. If you can just confirm that you can now see my presentation.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I think I'm just going to leave it as is, if you don't mind. I am on two screens here, and if I make it a slideshow, I tend to lose you. So I would rather not do that. So I think I'm going to start at the beginning. And just to say that Sai Mamabolo has actually presented what is fundamentally perhaps the sort of the fault line of what's happening in our electoral politics at the moment. And I will try to elaborate on that point in a few minutes at the end. But I think it was an excellent presentation because it laid the foundation of what's happening to public trust in South Africa, and how perhaps a decline in public trust in more specific things such as our actors, our political actors and our institutions is having an effect in terms of more negative attitudes towards the political regime and democracy more generally. And I'll come to that later. But I need to really start at the beginning to say that perhaps a degree of electoral volatility, I think we would all agree, is an essential element of democratic politics. Volatility in voter behavior brings about a degree of uncertainty as we go into an election, and that prompts elite responsiveness and accountability, vital ingredients for a democracy. And electoral volatility would manifest in different ways. So from a political science point of view, we're looking for voters who might decide their vote choice later in the campaign, or choose to split their support across different parties in the same election, split ticket voting. We might also see some voters shifting their support from one party to another across consecutive elections. These are what we call vote shifters. And funnily enough, abstention is also considered to be a form of volatility because it brings about a degree of uncertainty and instability in election results. And we know that individual level volatility has increased across democracies globally in recent decades. And this is largely due to a wider process of party de-alignment, as people globally have started to move away from feeling very close to political parties. There's evidence that the same process is unfolding in South Africa, although we have seen what appear to be static outcomes across our 6 large elections, our national elections. In fact, underneath, there are all sorts of signs of electoral volatility, and this is what we're going to talk about now. We see it notably in the waning fortunes of the larger political parties. We have seen through a number of public opinion surveys, which are nationally representative, declining levels of party identification. People in South Africa are moving away from feeling close to their parties. We have a declining turnout rate. And we also see an increasing inclination to switch across parties, across consecutive elections. And this is what I'm primarily interested in. But I think it's important to say that these empirical observations are very encouraging. Remember that we come from a history where South Africa has been long regarded as an electorate that is fixed by characterized by very fixed identities, such as race. And to a large extent, some scholars have portrayed us as an electorate with very low potential for movement, fluidity, volatility. But having said all of this, and all of this is good news, but having said this, the occurrence of vote shifting on the one hand and abstentions on the other are highly unequal. We have a situation where, while there are increasing numbers of South Africans who are self-declaring that they, in fact, indeed did move their support across parties between consecutive elections, we actually have many, many more, millions of South Africans who are not voting at all. In other words, they are struggling to defect and transition to other parties, and instead are choosing to abstain altogether. And in addition to this, and of course the IEC would remind us of this, we also have a bulging youthful population that has introduced millions of new, young South African potential voters, but these young people are not voting at the same rate as their older counterparts. And so we have a situation where millions are choosing to exit the party system on the one hand, many millions are choosing to simply abstain and not enter the party system. And as a result, we have rapidly declining turnout. And this has brought about all sorts of concerns about the civic mindedness of South Africans, particularly young South Africans, and also the possibility of widespread psychological disengagement that seems to be growing amongst the electorate. And I think also it's important to say that because we have seen such limited vote shifting with so many more abstentions, this has left the party system fundamentally unchanged since '94. We know that we have the primacy of the ANC within the party system, although with a shrinking majority. And this brings about all sorts of other concerns from scholars, pundits, people who watch democratic politics, about the possible dangers posed by long extended stints in power. And so I think the point here is that an ongoing democratization process in South Africa does rely to a large extent on greater individual level volatility. We need to see the sort of volatility that actually results in vote switching rather than simply abstention. And the vexing question that I'm left with is, in a party system that boasts over 200 registered political parties, why is it that so many millions of South Africans choose to abstain rather than to shift their support across the party landscape to a different alternative? And this is really the question that's been driving and motivating much of the research that I've done with other people, such as Professor Robert Mattis, and previously at UCT and now at Strathclyde University. And what I want to do now is to really take you through the signs of volatility in the electorate that are sometimes obvious to us and less obvious. What is preventing vote shifting in South Africa, and what seems to be producing abstentions, and how we can perhaps solve that. And I think this slide speaks to the fact that in recent years, there's been visible signs of change within the electorate. We know this. And the most obvious sign is the fact that the ANC's vote share has declined over time, down to 58% in the last election. It also means, of course, that the proportion of eligible South African voters casting a vote for the ANC has also declined over time, down to 28% of our voting age population actually casting a vote in the most recent election for the party. And here we see another visible indication of change, which can be found in our turnout rates. And for the first time, turnout as a proportion of the voting age population, this is our orange line, actually dropped under 50% in the recent 2019 elections. Of course, registered turnout continues to also decline. A less visible change that we're certainly monitoring would be changes within the electorate in terms of party loyalties, what we call party identification or partisanship. And this is most certainly declining in recent years in South Africa. And this is confirmed by a number of surveys across the field, Afrobarometer, the Comparative National Elections Project, which I'm speaking to, amongst others. Now here, I wanted to show the CNEP data indicating a decline in ANC identification over the last 4 elections. But what is interesting here is that we don't see any realignment, people moving their party identification to other parties. We can see that, in fact, the largest opposition party, the DA, did grow its partisan support base in the early years, but this is flatlined due to perhaps negative evaluations amongst citizens regarding the sort of ideological internal battles within the party and leadership issues. The exception here is the EFF, where you see suddenly the EFF entering electoral politics in 2014 and holding its own, but it certainly poses no great threat to any of the largest parties, certainly. This is an indication of the weakening impact of party identification. We measure the strength of partisan attachments amongst the electorate. And here I'm looking at particularly the ANC support base. What we see here is that, in fact, partisan intensity has actually increased over the years. And we've interpreted this to suggest that in the context of declining partisanship, what we're actually seeing here is that de-alignment has actually left behind only the most committed core partisans. These are the percentage of identifiers, party identifiers who are voting. And for us, this is very interesting because it's indicating that as partisanship has weakened in South Africa, what we also see is that there's a declining ability of political parties to actually mobilize their partisan support base. And this table shows that. It shows the decline in the percentage of party identifiers who are actually turning out to vote, particularly in the most recent elections. Here, we refer to the laggards. These are those of us who stayed at home on the day in terms of turning out for elections. And we can see which parties left more of their party identifiers at home. And in 2019, the laggards were spread across the ANC and the DA quite equally. But in fact, the EFF lost many of their self-declared partisans in this last election. Now, I want to turn to what we would call a disaggregated view of the South African electorate. And what we can see here are the changing dynamics amongst our partisans in the electorate, but also the changing dynamics amongst our non-partisans. So these are citizens who may well be active voters, but that don't feel close to a political party. So if we just have a look, first of all, at the self-declared partisans, and if I can direct you to the orange line at the top, this shows clearly over the last 3 elections a decline in identifiers who actually turn out to vote for their own party. So this is a decline in activity amongst what we would call party loyalists. they are simply not turning out. Then we see the associated increase in partisan abstainers in the dark blue line underneath. So these are those of us who do feel close to a party, but we did not vote. And what is interesting is right at the bottom in the gray line, we see a marginal increase in what we call partisan defectors, voters who do feel close to a party, but in fact for the one election defected and voted for another party for whatever reason. But we know that this is now a very small, increasing, but very small proportion of all partisan activity. Now, if we look at our non-partisans, what are they doing? Well, in the yellow line, these are non-partisans who voted, and you can see that we have a decline there. We can think of these people as independents. They're active, they vote, but they don't feel close to a party. They're on the decline. And non-partisans who are not voting are beginning to increase and have just overtaken the active non-partisans in the light blue line. So this all illustrates something for us, that fluidity, volatility at the individual level has not increased in the way that we might imagine and might expect with partisan de-alignment. Overall, we can see that turnout has decreased amongst our partisans and our non-partisans. There's very little increase in party defection, and we just seem to be faced with substantial increases in abstentions across the board. Now, I just want to stop for a moment and look at some of the good news. There are signs of voter fluidity in the electorate, and this is captured, as I said earlier, by our switchers and by our party splitters, and I will just briefly look at these two. We can see here that what I've done is I've captured respondents in our nationally representative survey who indicated that they changed their vote choice, their party choice between the 2014 and the 2019 election. In other words, they shifted their support across the party landscape between these two consecutive elections. And this really matches with our previous surveys, which seems to suggest that the percentage of switchers in the active South African electorate is on the increase. From around 8% we saw between the 1999 and 2004 election. And in fact, this has increased up to about 14% in this particular recent two elections. And if we look at this figure, the surprise, I think, for all of us is that there's a fairly substantial flow of voters moving between different political parties. And this inter-party movement is indicative of partisan de-alignment. It also suggests that the extent of vote shifting at the individual level has probably been more dynamic than many of us would have credited, and that what's happening is that the relatively even and flows between party have actually camouflaged this volatility. So what we are left with, however, is, I think more alarmingly, in this last election, the three largest parties tend to lose a great deal of their support in 2014 into the abstention category in 2019. And we can see those flows out of the ANC, DA, and more so out of the EFF into the abstention category. And this would certainly confirm the fact that we saw a decline in party turnout, voter turnout in 2019. We can see that, in fact, people are leaving the active electorate in the last election. It also confirms this concern that we have that there's an inability amongst voters to be able to shift their support to other parties. Okay, so now I'm going to very briefly speak about split ticket voting, what we call splitters. These are voters who actually cast a vote for the same, for a different party at national and provincial level in the same election. And we know that most South Africans choose to support the same party at both levels of government when they cast their two ballots in the general elections. But there are a growing number of people who are splitting their ballots. And again, this is indicative of partisan de-alignment. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because we are pressed for time. But having had a close look at the 2019 data, it confirms what we might have expected out of that election, that the Ramaphosa effect that dominated 2019 seems to have urged a number of South Africans to actually support the return of Cyril Ramaphosa on their national ballot, whilst voting for an opposition party on their provincial ballot. And this is found amongst both ANC and opposition supporters. And this is what we would have expected to see. And we can certainly come back to this. So there is evidence of some volatility with splitting one's vote. Now, I just want to turn to what I think is the most important part of this paper, which is, why is it that some voters are able to transition across the landscape to another party, our switchers? And why is it that some voters are just unable to do this? What is inhibiting movement across parties? In other words, what is the blockage for abstention? And then finally, I don't think we'll have time to look at it, but I have included data that tries to understand why some young people are turning out to vote, whilst many millions more are not. And if I can turn to this table, what I've done here is I've taken our data and built a model to explore the movement from the ANC to somewhere else in between 2014 and 2019. So you can think of our dependent variable as having three possible outcomes. You either loyally stayed with the same party across the two consecutive elections. In other words, you voted for the ANC in 2014, you stayed with the ANC in 2019. Those are our loyalists. Or you switched parties. You voted for the ANC in 2014, and then you cast a vote for a different party in 2019. These are our switches, and this is indicated in the first column here of data. Or in fact, you voted for the ANC in 2014, but you abstained in 2019. And we can think of the first category, as I said, as an act of loyalty. The second and third categories are both acts of volatility. However, switching from one party to another does mean that you can think of this as voicing some discontent, but remaining active within the party system. This category is a situation where, in fact, you exit the party system. And I will not go into the reasons as to why I have included these independent variables, just to say that, of course, they are grounded in the international literature on what we would expect to drive participation in elections, but also what may drive switching and abstention. And I think let's just go straight to the findings. I think the most interesting finding certainly was that political disaffection with democracy more generally and with the political system mostly seems to explain abstention. We can see these are all significant coefficients. In other words, general political disaffection with the regime seems to actually produce abstention in South Africa. It does not have any effect on shifting. What does have an effect on shifting is specific dissatisfaction with the ANC's performance in the past 5 years. And we would expect that. If you are dissatisfied with your particular party, you move away. But what's important here is to note that over here, these coefficients are not significant, indicated by the star. They are not significant for switches. Switches are still invested in the system. They're able to cast their eye across political parties. They don't perceive the system to be unresponsive. They're not discontented with democracy necessarily, and they are still invested and switching their support. I now want to move to this block of variables here called choice. A number of papers that Bob and I have done in recent years have suggested that if voters cannot identify a choice, in other words, a supply of political parties to switch to, they simply will not switch their support. In other words, we need a supply side for voters. And we have argued here and elsewhere that, first of all, we need to be able to identify a political party that we believe to be inclusive of all groups in South Africa. And we can read this often as a racial, through a racial lens. Many South Africans are looking for political parties that are racially inclusive of all groups. And then secondly, of course, we would need to perceive a party that we would want to move our support to as being competent. Can this political party govern as well or better than the current political party in power? And of course, the data was very comforting. It certainly showed that right over here, before you can shift your support to another party, you need to be able to perceive that there's at least one opposition party you believe to be inclusive and competent. Over here, this has no effect on abstention, and it led us finally to the point that the profiles of party switchers versus abstainers are quite different. It appears to us from this data that party switchers are engaged citizens. These are people who are exercising very specific evaluations about political parties. They may express dissatisfaction and they can use their vote to punish a political party by moving their support. In other words, they're able to transition across the party landscape. But it's very important that these evaluations, these very specific evaluations of alternatives matter deeply to their ability to transition. And optimistically, these voters are still very much invested in the electoral system and the political system at large. And they differ quite dramatically from abstainers. The concern we have here is that it seems that disaffection with the broader democratic regime are producing abstentions. These citizens are probably perceiving the democratic regime to be largely unresponsive, and they have, as a result, disengaged from electoral politics to the extent that they're not even paying much attention to these specific evaluations of the actors, the political parties, the campaigns. Their attention is not on the campaign at all. And they are now positioning themselves at the periphery of politics. So I think there are two takeaway issues here. The one is that if we want to see greater electoral volatility in South Africa, we need to enable a transition from one party to another. And it seems that that largely depends on being able to identify credible political alternatives. And vote switching can only really happen if voters are able to identify credible alternatives. In other words, choice is a prerequisite for increasing volatility. But negativity, the negative sentiments that we see directed at the democratic system at large, which of course Mamabolo has pointed to in detail, this is producing abstention in South Africa. And I would suggest it's a result of a prolonged period of mistrust and distrust and low external efficacy, negative views of the responsiveness of the political system at large. And this has brought about a broader disengagement from perhaps one of the most important democratic acts that citizens can do, which is voting. So you can see here that these two different types of electoral volatility are both highly numerically unequal in South Africa. And while switching has a positive implication for deepening democratic competitive politics, what we are seeing is that abstention is actually simply just reinforcing the status quo and not bringing about the sort of uncertainty that we might want at competitive elections. And I think I will stop there. I'm very mindful of time, and you can guide me in terms of whether I have more time or whether we can just pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spell-Heisenberg. Can we pause for now, give Dr. Kadima a chance to present, and then perhaps we'll be able to engage some of your other data, particularly around young people, in the Q&A section.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'd like to now welcome Mr. Kadima of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa, who is the executive director. And he'll be sort of analyzing for us the role of election observers in particular in the local government elections, particularly as we are in the midst of COVID-19. As you might be aware, the Democracy Development Program, along with its partners in the KZN Democracy and Elections Forum, does deploy quite a significant number of election observers in the interests of trying to ensure that we create the necessary trust in the process, but also that we vet the work that's being done in the various electoral processes. And so we'd like to welcome Dr. Kadima to do a bit of analysis for us in terms of what that role will look like in the time that we're currently observing, but also in the interest of restoring the necessary public trust and the vigor in the public participation space. One of the comments that came in, I think, whilst Mr. Simon Mamabolo was rounding up his presentation, was from our former executive director, Dr. Raman Naidu, around saying all the data that we're seeing shows only one thing: citizens are becoming more and more cynical about the state of democracy in our country. The decline in confidence can be attributed directly to the way in which the ruling party continue to fight amongst themselves for power, money, and influence, whilst we as citizens remain outside the arenas onlookers. Citizens are angry and tired. It's time for civil society organizations to support citizens to claim back our power and our country for all of us. We can no longer ignore the increasing income gap between the have and have not. And I think your presentation, Mr. Kadima, will come right into the space of what the role of civil society in this instance is likely to be. Thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to everyone who's taking part in this exchange. Of course, I thank you, DDP, for the opportunity. And those who spoke before me made very good presentations, which form a good background to what I'm going to say. I'm going to talk very briefly about elections and election observation, and then I'll move to the traditional role of observer missions before ending with the role of observers in the context of COVID-19. And I would like also to say that election observation has many components. You may have international election observation and national election observation. I'm not going to talk about international election observation because we are talking here about citizen participation in politics. So we'll talk about citizen participation, and we will not talk about observation by political parties, which we call partisan observation. That is it's similar, but it has a different purpose. So we are not talking about that. And the interest of this topic, as Mandla said, it's about citizen participating and owning the electoral process. And a way of doing it is by participating in an election observation mission. Of course, the role, I can say from the onset that the role of an election observation mission before COVID and at the time of COVID is largely the same. The differences is about the approach to election observation, but we'll look into that. So let's start by saying that elections are important in this context because they bring together people. Elections are a defining instant of widespread societal participation in political decision-making. And this public gathering make voters and observers vulnerable to COVID. But of course, it is important that in an electoral process, there is election observation because these are a group of people who are citizens and they belong to different political parties, and we can consider them as being impartial and even neutral in some cases. And their role is about on-site fact-finding to gather information and make an informed judgment about the integrity of the electoral process. And election observation can take the form of long-term observation and short-term observation. When we talk about long-term observation, we're talking about everything that is being observed throughout the electoral process. And most of the time, people will focus on voter registration, campaign, and voting. But of course, you have the legal framework and all of that, which is important, but that is done by everyone observing. But long-term observation have those key moments, like when people go out to register, when they campaign, and of course on the voting day and the process of result tabulation and so on. But short-term observation focuses on voting day, voting and counting operations. Now, so these processes, you know, of as I said earlier, observers, their role is to assess the integrity of the electoral process. You know, like, is it credible? Is it transparent? They can look at the level of participation and so on, and make recommendation. Now, what has been the role of voters in a normal situation? Let's first say that observing election has become part of, it has been a tradition. You know, in the past, observers used to face a lot of challenges in terms of accreditation, in terms of getting all the necessary documents to be able to sit in a polling station, voting station. But increasingly, it approved. In South Africa, it has never been really a problem to allow people in to get accreditation and participate in voting. But given that elections do not take place in isolation from broader societal and political challenges, the challenges are often, like in our context, of history and history nature. A challenge of observer particularly is to understand the context of election, to raise funds to deploy a mission that can be difficult, and of course to decide whether to observe in a long term, through a long term process or a short term. Of course, that depends on resources and on the capacity of observer mission. But election observation traditionally also can play a very important role in terms of, through their observation, they can help prevent, manage election-related conflicts or disputes, especially when they may turn violent. So through the impartial and timely reporting, and through also the ability to identify strengths and weaknesses in the electoral process, Electoral Commission and other stakeholders, including political parties, to avoid a violent process. So observation remains an important aspect of the electoral process and may have a positive impact in many areas, such as boosting voter confidence in the electoral process. They may encourage everyone to play by the rule, but by virtue of being there in a, let's say, in a polling station or in a campaign facility, or even during voter registration, if they have the resources to cover such early phase of the electoral process. So they can encourage participants, candidates, and parties to play by the rules. And also they may deter fraud, malpractices, and irregularities, alleviate conflict and violence, as I said earlier, and of course, last but not the least, to spread and share good electoral standards or good practices, as we call them. Of course, the electoral observer missions don't always find it easy, because past experiences have shown that there are areas where they need to improve it. For instance, many observer missions don't carry proper training of their delegates, and that may compromise the quality of their work. And of course, remember, citizen observation is observation by citizen. And these people are voters themselves. So it means they have a preference. Sometimes the line is very small between, being partisan and not partisan. So that level of independence sometimes may be doubted by stakeholders. That's why sometimes it's good when citizen observers are complemented by international observers. But in the context of local elections, most international groups will not come because this is purely a citizen exercise. So the lack of training, of good training, may lead people to make very superficial assessments, and also lack of independence, and maybe being a supporter of a political party may lead to some superficial conclusion. Many observers tend to base their statement on political consideration rather than a professional way of looking at the process. And but broadly speaking, that's what we can say about the role of observers and their challenges traditionally. But now, with the COVID-19, there is a new element that come into play, or that come at play. Election observation taking place presently, like in the case of the expected local government election in South Africa, there will be some major restriction. When we know that there's a curfew from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. every day. So that can only impact also on the observation, and gathering are not allowed. The number of people who can participate in an event is very limited. And election is not only about getting people in stadia and so on, but it's also a show of strength. Parties want to show that they are popular. They want to show that they are going to win, because when they have a big crowd, it can encourage other people, because most people like to vote for those who are going to win. I've seen in many countries. I was recently in Cote d'Ivoire and Niger. During elections, parties, including governing parties, have ignored the measures. They've been filling up stadium and people, screaming and no one wearing masks and so on. So large gatherings are hard to prevent, but and in this context, this can be terribly dangerous. Of course, restaurants being closed, and the context of COVID has also come with something that is job loss. People have lost their jobs, so even the ability for citizens to organize, raise funds is quite difficult. I know some are trying to do their best, but in this context, it's not easy. So the lockdown, the difficult economic conditions, all of that may restrict recruitment, training, deployment, because it takes place the entire day. People must be fed and all of that. It can be very difficult. Experienced election observation mission can share good practices, how to protect their observers, because you can no longer deploy your mission, just say you train people and you deploy them. No, nowadays observers must be protected. You must make sure that all the measures are in place. Increasingly, and Sai Mamabolo mentioned that increasingly online election operations are taking place, like the IEC is conducting voter registration online, which is a quite positive thing. Campaign also can take place online, and they've been taking place online in many places, not only online, but let's say through distance means. And many other techniques are being used, but as I indicated earlier, those are not always easy to follow by observers, and because gatherings are still taking place, observers have to use both traditional and COVID-related approaches to be able to assess an electoral process. Now, what has been observers have been doing increasingly, which is important for citizen groups to also learn. What we do nowadays is Election Observer Mission set up a COVID operational system of prevention from the start of the mission. You know, you must have a dedicated unit, a unit dedicated for dealing with issues of elections and of COVID as far as observers are concerned. So, and have a security team with a health component to monitor observers' compliance, because they can contaminate each other and they can and also even contaminate voters and other stakeholders, party leaders, candidates, and so on. Of course, the traditional means of preventing COVID have been highlighted in terms of distanciation, masks, using the alcohol and have a thermometer so that the team can have it all the time, and first aid, drugs. All of that are the things that have become even more important than in traditional observer missions. And also have observers must be provided with a health map of health institutions, so that when there is a problem with cases, they can quickly in the neighborhood or let's say in the areas of their deployment, send the person to the right facility. And also we traditionally have, and now it's even more so, have a mission WhatsApp group and dealing a lot also with issues pertaining to COVID. So in conclusion, because I know we are running out of time, in substance, the role of observer mission is to scrutinize the integrity of the electoral process and assess the electoral process and make recommendations to the different authorities, like electoral authorities, but also other stakeholders. And during the COVID context or era which we are in, observer missions have been going an extra mile, and this is essential in terms of protecting their teams of observers from COVID. And in that process, we can say that their role nowadays will not only be about assessing an election and sharing good electoral practices, but it's also becoming about sharing, complying and sharing good COVID-19 protection measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kadima, for your presentation. I'd like to invite our delegates, in case there are any questions that you'd like to pose to either Mr. Kadima or Dr. Colette in relation to their presentations, that you please raise your hand or include it in the chat section. We are, of course, going to be moving to our next session shortly, but we would like to have an opportunity to engage both Dr. Colette as well as Denis in relation to that. We do have a hand from Mrs. Shahana Kaji. I think she's with Democratic Alliance in KwaZulu Natal. You may unmute and you may proceed with your question, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I just have a question for Colette. You know, the strange thing is that there are a lot of small parties, very, very small parties, very insignificant parties that spring up around election time. And what would her opinion be about people actually knowing the fact that these parties don't make any significant difference, whether they're, in municipalities or at national level? But why would it be that people actually vote for those parties? It just doesn't make sense when you look at the really tiny parties and you find people actually. Is it because they identify with with the party, or is it because they just want to punish the bigger parties? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question in relation to the smaller parties. There is another question now in our chat section that I hadn't engaged from Omololu, and I think I'd like to address it to both Dr. Colette and Mr. Kadima in terms of your assessment of what this question speaks to. What are the significant impacts of cadre deployment approach on public trust in South African government and institutions? If it is significant, will it not be proper to begin a reassessment of the political system in a manner that would promote inclusivity and public accountability, as an additional question that you might engage with? Of course, let's start with you, Dr. Colette.
Thank you so much, Pamandla. I will try to address both questions. Yes, it is interesting that very small parties that actually crop up just before an election and manage to muster sufficient resources to register and so on actually do collect votes. But I think it must be kept in proportion. It's still a tiny fraction or proportion of votes that they do attract. And there's very little research on the very small parties in South Africa, perhaps because they are seen as basically inconsequential to the sort of larger body politic and the dynamics that are going on. But I would hazard a guess that both your suggestions are absolutely spot on. And I would be very interested in looking at the geography of the votes that are cast for these very small parties. I would imagine that many of the votes cast have some bearing geographically to where the party leader resides. In other words, there's something about the personality of that leader that has some sort of traction in a community. We see that particularly at local government elections, a lot of small parties that are built around a particular individual or two do attract localized support. So I think that is one possible explanation. And of course, the second explanation that you put up would be, well, it's an attempt to punish the larger parties. And yes, so these are voters who are swinging away from the larger parties and for whatever reason could perhaps be even launching a protest vote. But because there are so many small parties out there with such different ideological thrusts, it's quite difficult to say. It may be that, in fact, some of these very small parties push a particular sectoral interest, such as a religious perspective, and that would explain some of their support. So I think more research is required to understand that base of support. I mean, the big question I would ask is whether they maintain that support across elections. And it seems that many of these small parties come and go. So it's clear that they don't manage to maintain the support that they did get at a previous election. And this could have much to do with the fact that they aren't able to put a policy platform forward that is in any way attractive from a longevity point of view. Cadre deployments. Yes, I think we may be at the point in South Africa, and a number of people have written about this, that in fact, the policy of cadre deployment may now be actually having very negative effects for the governing party rather than positive effects. I mean, it was initially meant to create far more representation amongst our public institutions and our public administration. But what it has inadvertently done is created opportunities, as we know, for nepotism and patronage. And this has come to the fore in the last few years through the State Capture Commission and other mechanisms. And I think at this point in time, it's really damaging the governing party significantly. What South Africans really want to see are competent people holding public positions, drawing salaries from the public purse and really meeting their public roles with as much credibility and integrity as possible. And so from a public ethics point of view, I think the cadre deployment policy no longer holds. We can see that the detrimental effects of perhaps how we've undermined the best possible people to step forward for these positions has had a detrimental effect on service delivery and our ability to roll out public services. And so I think, for a party like the ANC to do some recovery in the mind of the public in terms of trust, it's going to need to be seen to be really exercising massive integrity and public sector ethics as it goes about choosing individuals to hold these very important roles.
Thank you very much, Dr. Colette. Denis, if you could maybe respond to that last question that I had posed relating to the impact of cadre deployment on public trust and on government institutions and political parties, and perhaps what sort of reconfiguration of the electoral system might there be to increase the potential for this to happen?
Look, of course, it's not directly related to my presentation, but of course, if the deployment of cadres is not based on merit, of course, down the line, people will see that, you know, people who have been appointed are not meeting their needs, and it will down the line affect public trust in public administration and any other institution where these cadres are deployed. And if there's no delivery, service delivery and all of that, people will be disillusioned with such system of doing things. It may end up with voter turnout being low or people boycotting, as Colette has been you know, competently explaining it. So there's nothing to say, nothing more to say about it. It's true that the impact of such process can be very, very bad if it's not based on merit. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kadima. There is another comment in the chat section from Dr. Ramanaidu. The small parties will come into their own when they are connected to communities in real ways and they've earned their respect. They should focus on local government elections and really serve their community leaders out there who need to stand up either as individuals or think about how they can instill faith in all of us again by becoming active in politics. The ANC has to clean up its house in a transparent and forceful way if it's going to retain any sense of credibility as a party that citizens would vote for. If there are any additional questions, I would encourage our delegates to please raise their hand so that we can prompt them. If not, you are welcome to also type in the chat section. We'd like to also just make mention and thank very excitedly that our chairperson of our board at the Democracy Development Program has been able to join us in this program, Dr. J.V. Rajab. Thank you very much. We appreciate the support. We've also got our donor partner, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, represented here by Mr. Christian Andres, who is based in the Cape Town office. And we would like to be thankful for that as well. The next session is intended to engage with political parties regarding the subject matter that we have today. Of course, we did invite all the political parties that are represented in the legislature of the KZN legislature in particular. And we did have feedback from 4 political parties. However, I do see that we only have currently 1 political party represented. But before we move to that session, can we please ask Dr. Colette if you could engage us please on your final part of your presentation as it relates to young people and why they vote and not vote, so that we can go into the next session fully sort of prepared with some real engagement along those lines for political parties.
Pamandla, I'd be happy to. Just let me quickly learn how to share the screen again. I think this is the correct one. Are you seeing a table?
Yes, yes, with bars, okay, a bar graph.
Correct. And what I'm going to do is also just to, yeah, okay, great. So to basically continue very briefly for 2 minutes, one of the concerns I think we all have is that we've seen this withdrawal of young people from South Africa's elections. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. And we shouldn't become too paranoid. This is not a South African problem. We've seen the withdrawal of young people from electoral politics globally. Most established democracies are having this experience. However, and I've done some research to suggest that we're actually having it's having a far more detrimental effect on our aggregate turnout rates in South Africa, because young people, as we know, comprise a large bulging part of our youthful population. And as they withdraw from politics, and as time passes and they are replacing older cohorts, their withdrawal from politics and their far lower turnout rates is actually pulling the aggregate turnout rate in South Africa down without much change at the individual level. So in other words, when we look at the voting age population aggregate turnout rate, as young people are coming in and forming a larger proportion of our electorate, they are not voting, and this simply decreases the overall aggregate voter turnout rate. So that is part of the reason why we've seen a decline in participation at elections. It's not the only reason. People who were formerly active have also withdrawn. This table shows voter turnout as a proportion of the voting age population in the 2014 and the 2016 municipal elections. And the data isn't much different for 2019. I just simply haven't added it yet. And we can see there that the 18 to 19-year-olds, only 27% of all eligibles actually cast a vote in 2014. This actually dropped somewhat in 2019. 46% of 20 to 29-year-olds cast a vote in 2014, and this again dropped in 2019. So we also seem to have a situation where, if you look at the data, and I don't have it here, but if you look at the data, there seems to be this habit of learning not to vote. And as cohorts are coming in, the proportion of young people voting is dropping. And this is quite concerning. What I want to then just conclude by saying, and again, another big regression table, and it's not there to give us a headache, but to really show a couple of interesting findings. We looked at young people versus older people in a large model, and we tested a number of different theories of turnout, why people vote, why they don't. And what we basically found is that there is a distinction between what's driving young people versus older people. They differ systematically from older cohorts in a number of ways. First of all, we know young people are not attached to political parties. So that motivation to vote because you have an attachment to a political party is missing amongst most of our youth. So partisanship is just not having effect on young people. It certainly still has an effect on those of us who are older. We also know, and we can see from this table, that young people are not mobilized to vote by what we would call social intermediaries or institutions that they frequent. So whereas I might be mobilized to vote by perhaps the church I attend or the institution I work in, or perhaps the trade union I belong to, young people don't yet have those effects. They are disengaged from big social institutions that would necessarily mobilize us to vote. And then I think most interestingly, we're back to external political efficacy. In other words, this view of whether the political system is responsive and accountable, and also one's perceived view or role in the political system vis-a-vis these external actors. And here we see quite clearly that young people tend not to vote if they perceive that politicians do not care about them, if the external political system is not responsive to their needs. And this is some of the first indications that we're getting that, in fact, young people differ systematically from older people on this very variable. What we also see, what is very interesting, is that young people, if they do turn out to vote, are using short-term performance evaluations as opposed to older people who rather rely on partisanship and mobilization and so on. And this is encouraging because it means that young people are really looking at the activities and the performance of political parties and actors, and this determines whether they vote or not. And then finally, if you zoom in and just look amongst young people themselves, we found a disturbing finding where it seems that young people with a higher education level are far more likely to turn out than young people with a much lower education level. And this leads me to think that perhaps, you know, voting is going to become the preserve of young people with higher levels of education, whilst we see other young people who have perhaps not had the advantages of finishing high school and going into tertiary, actually becoming quite systematically, psychologically disengaged from formal electoral politics. So there's a lot here to discuss, but that just gives you a taste of some of the research and the findings that we've found comparing young to older people and then looking amongst young people themselves.
Thank you very much, Dr. Colette, for that presentation, as well as just for your insights in the past couple of minutes. We do appreciate your willingness to participate, as well as Mr. Kadima, in relation to that. We'll move shortly into our last session, but of course we ask both yourself and Dr. Kadima, Mr. Kadima, to just remain with us so that you can give us maybe a final input at the end of that session, so that we can have maybe a more rounded conclusion to our process for today. I'm going to hand over to my co-facilitator, Dr. Isaac Khambule from the University of KwaZulu Natal. He is a lecturer and researcher for the built environment, for the School of Built Environment at the University of KwaZulu Natal, and he'll be engaging with political parties as well as civil society organizations who are in the space. So I'll just hand over to him, and the floor is yours, Mnumzan.
Thank you, Spamandla Zondi, for the opportunity to facilitate this session. And as Spamandla has stated, my name is Isaac Khambule. I'm with the School of Built Environments and Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu Natal, where I teach economic development and political economy. And I'd also like to thank the three previous speakers, particularly the last two presentations that were done by Dr. Schulz-Hesenberg and Mr. Kadima. I believe that some of the important issues that you have raised really touch on the nitty-gritty of public trust in the South African local government system, and as well on our political leaders at the local government, particularly our ward councillors. So having said this, I mean, we touched on issues of party loyalty and the decline in the voting system, and as well as the increase in non-partisanship when it comes to voting in South Africa. And that on its own tells us that quite a lot has been happening, and the voting landscape is evolving to a new trajectory that has never been seen in the South African context, as of course we saw 2016 during the local government elections, and as well as the decline of the ANC in the national government elections in 2019. And all of these have taken us to the much anticipated 2021 local government elections, of which are likely to be postponed until next year. And the majority of the questions that are on people's ears are mainly based on what kind of electoral outcomes are we likely to see in terms of voting patterns at the local government level. And recently I was working with the DDP as well. We focused on issues on a paper I wrote on the changing trends in terms of the role of the youth in the electoral in South Africa. So that on its own tells us that if you look at the shift we see in universities, you realize that emerging political parties such as your DA and your EFF are really taking a chunk of the ANC loyal voters within the university systems, and that on its own has a trickle effect on what we are likely to see in the local government elections probably next year if we are to have an election. And I would also touch on one particular point that has really played a significant role in the decline in public trust in the local government system that was mentioned by Dr. Hesenberg, and that is mainly on the idea of cadre deployment. And one of the most important questions that we need to ask ourselves is, why is cadre deployment not working in the South African context, whereas we see that it is working in some other countries? It does work to some extent in the UK, it does work to some extent in China. So based on the work that I've done, it mostly tells us that the caliber of deployment or of the cadre that you have that you're going to deploy in key government positions matters. For instance, if you have a caliber that mostly looks after the interest of a political party, chances are they are not going to have national interest at heart. Whereas if you go to other countries that have successfully deployed their cadres within strategic government positions, such as China, you realize that the most important thing is national goals as to how such cadres are going to improve in as much as they're there on a political basis. But then at the end of the day, it is mostly about the national and institutional goals. So for this particular session, we were supposed to have a discussion on public trust with some of the political parties that were in the program, such as your ANC, your IFP, and your DA. And I note that the DA is represented by Councillor Shehana Kaji, and other parties are not represented. So in order to make up for that, we'll also invite civil society organizations that are here with us to also relate as to how they are playing an active role in terms of representing the interest of local voters. But most importantly, before I move from that particular point, we saw with the recent spate of looting in KwaZulu Natal in Gauteng, and to some extent, in as much as the president has termed it as an insurrection, we also realize that some of those underpinning issues are related to the socio-economic development and outcomes of people at the local government level. And that on its own tells us that South Africa has one of the highest poverty rates based on the statistics of 2017 through the multidimensional poverty index. We realized that more than 55% of South Africans lived in poverty by 2017, and the unemployment rate currently is sitting at 32.7, and that on its own tells us that the South African landscape is changing and it is becoming more demanding. And as we understand, during the height of the pandemic, there has been an increase in demand for local government services. And in most cases, some governments cannot even provide such benefit to such people. So some of the most important questions that then we're going to arise as of this discussion that we're going to have, we're mainly going to focus on why are people not voting at the local elections? And second, as to what factors drive a decline in public trust. Some of them were mentioned by the previous speakers. And also we are also related to, we also want to understand as to what are political parties doing in local structures to enhance the voting mechanisms that are deployed to ensure again that the voter turnout increases in South Africa. And again, what are political parties also doing in terms of visiting local branches to understand as to why people are staying away from the polls. So in doing so, I would also like to invite Sheena Kaji from the DA, and maybe just to give us a perspective from the DA as to what has been some of the analysis as to why are people increasingly not voting for certain political parties, including the DA in itself, and as to what are the mechanisms that the DA has deployed at the subnational level to ensure that they attract as many voters as they can. And in doing so, we'll also like to invite any civil society organizations that are part of this discussion today, particularly the Deaf Society in South Africa, to also tell us as to what are some of the mechanisms that are in place for people with disabilities in terms of ensuring that their votes count and also ensuring that their voices also count within these political structures. So I'm gonna hand over.
Dr. Khambule, just
yes.
the ACDP is also present.
Okay.
I just got a message from Melissa Isaiah.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that counts the ESOP using her page,
yes,
or if it's been changed to Melissa itself.
Yes, so I can see that we have Melissa Isaiah and we also have Shehana Kaji from the DA and the ACDP. So based on those two particular representatives for those particular political parties, may we get a feeling as a room here as to what is the mood within these representative political parties in terms of the voting outcomes and the voter turnout in South Africa, and as to what are they doing in order to try and address the votes that are largely moving away from voting and also ensuring that South Africans have a voice in the local government election. So I would like to open that to the floor to Melissa and Shehana. I will start with Shehana Kaji. Is Shihana? Okay, I think we've lost Shehana for now. Melissa, will you kindly take the podium if time permits? Thank you so much.
Greetings, beloved, in the precious name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Yes, I am in for Jamil Yusuf. As the ACDP, I think the reason why people have lost hope in the voting system is because of the promises that have been made to the people and that have been broken. You know, there were a lot of empty promises that were made to the people. Like recently, when we look at the unrest that has taken place that has shook South Africa and has taken place in most of the areas, the army was promised to be deployed on that Sunday afternoon. But unfortunately, the army was only visible. SANDF was only visible, I think, 5 days later. So if the promises that we made to the people that we kept, those promises were kept and not broken, then we would get more people trusting in the system of voting. But I think this is where we come in as the different political parties, where we can be at peace with each other. And I think another thing that is very, very detrimental is the conflicts that political parties have within each other, in the party, within the party. And I think the fighting that's within the party and all of the things that happens within the party is affecting the community, it's affecting the country, it's affecting each and every individual. And that is why people don't want to vote anymore. And the sad part of it is there's some political parties such as the ACDP that's always upholds integrity and biblical values and principles and love and unity and peace. But we are not getting trusted because of what the other political parties, because of how the other political parties have let the people down. So it's time now that South Africa comes together. It's time now that each political party come together as one, as humanity. It's not about, it shouldn't be about race, about political differences. It shouldn't be about culture or religion, but it's about coming together for our people. Putting our people first, the community first. And, we should feel for each other. And I think the ACDP, what we have been doing in order to try and get people to vote is we've been going out into the communities and encouraging people to vote. However, the levels of the lockdown, the restrictions have been quite heavy now that we are unable to do that. But we're trying to do it on media platforms, on social media, on WhatsApp groups, and wherever we can to encourage people. Their vote can make a difference, and they should trust again and trust people that won't let them down. So that's basically what the ACDP has been doing.
Thank you, Melissa. And basically from what you've shared, the certain points that I'm getting, firstly, one thing that I believe that you shared quite nicely is the idea that the lack of political trust in one governing party has resulted in the lack of trust in all political parties in the South African landscape. And that tells us that within the governance landscape, most people will then necessarily take what one political party is doing and then blame all political parties. So in this particular instance, we are also seeing some emerging contradictions within the mayhem that we had in KwaZulu-Natal, because we realized that in the midst of the mayhem, there was a lack of, or there was an absence of ward councillors or political leaders in terms of calming the mayhem, whether it is in CBDs, whether it is in some of the townships. So that on its own tells us that this is likely to increase the lack of trust in our political system, of which also translates to a lack of trust in our government. And we often see this playing out between voters and political leaders. But then with the recent mayhem, I foresee it playing and itself out, even within residents of certain communities who then start having questions about the kind of leadership that we have in place. So having stated that, let me see if Shahina is available. Shahina, Kaji, would you like to give us an overview as to how the Democratic Alliance has been trying to engage with the issue of a lower voter turnout and some of the mechanisms that it has in place in terms of ensuring an increased interest within political parties or within the DA in itself?
Thank you so much for that question. What the DA has basically done, first I'd like to just correct, I'm not a councillor. I am an activist, but I'm the Deputy Provincial Chair for KZN. I'm not a public rep at all. I think our stance has always been that our councillors needed to be on the ground with the citizens, and wherever possible, we need to address their service delivery issues, whether we were it was, a DA ward or any other ward. And our public reps were instructed to be on the ground as much as possible, be available as much as possible, and also assist wherever possible. It's part of our constitution that the DA cares about the community more than we obviously care about the votes, but we needed to show that as a political party, we're just not there for just to get the votes and then forget about the citizens. So that was the one thing that we've done in terms of, and this has been in place for many, many years. And then, yes, we have had issues, but our internal issues were made worse by the media. They weren't as bad as the media made them out to be, which is the reason why, we hope that there will be some kind of oversight as far as the media is concerned and what they report, because a lot of it was just misconstrued, and that was a huge part of the issues pertaining to the internal conflict. It wasn't as bad as the media made it out to be. Thirdly, we've also focused on contacting people, one-on-one, face-to-face. That's something that we've always maintained. We insist on actually speaking to people. We have our activities, political activities, where residents are allowed to or have the freedom to meet with our public reps and engage them on whatever issues they have. When it comes to the what we call the 6 days of anarchy, as my provincial leader Francois Rogers terms it, the moment that everything erupted, our provincial chairperson Dean McPherson got hold of our federal leader John Steenhuisen, who then set up a task team. And if people really want to know the truth about how the increase of the troops on the ground came about, was because of Cobus Marie, our MP for Defense. We were at a meeting where we were told that there were just about 2,500 troops being sent to KZN, whereas there were a large number of troops being sent to Gauteng at that time. And we obviously realized that the biggest problem here is the difference between the support for Zuma, and we have to admit that our premier and our eThekwini mayor were very instrumental in holding back the defense force and the police. There was a time that the police didn't even have rubber bullets or ammunition, and one of our members, Oki, actually spoke to the minister, to somebody, and in the next day a plane full of ammunition was sent to KZN. So the biggest problem we're having at the moment is, well, we're actually capitalizing at this point in time because we realized that, or rather John Steenhuisen realized that from Cape Town, he couldn't understand the real issues that were, or how serious the issue was on the ground. And he then insisted on coming down. We were worried about his safety, but as far as he was concerned, he needed to be on the ground. He was the first leader on the ground, and together with our provincial leader, Francois Rogers, and Dean McPherson, our chair, they started doing assessments around the province. They're still busy with it. They're still moving around. That's Francois and Dean. They're still going around the province, assessing the damage and trying to see where we are able to assist in terms of getting sponsors and so on. What I'd really like to emphasize is when the 250 when the 25,000 troops were sent in, that was thanks to Kobus Maree, our Minister of Defense. We have been proactive in this entire, so we weren't expecting it. We knew there was going to be trouble, but in the night of the arrest of previous President Zuma, we had our people on the ground in Nkandla also observing and concerned about the fact that this was going to break out and it was going to be a huge problem. So we were well prepared in terms of, we were bracing ourselves for trouble. The thing that we found very, very unacceptable was the fact that it has come to our knowledge that that the government was aware of this this rioting that was due to take place. They had intel about a month before that this was going to happen, and that was not passed on to anybody. And as a result, we saw what we did. So from our point, our whole at the moment, what we're focusing on is not canvassing, is not worrying. We're not worrying about the votes at this point in time. All we've been instructed to do is to help on the ground. And this is the standpoint of the DA. And I must say that, it's been very upsetting to see that other political parties hadn't actually come out and supported. I mean, John was all over. Other political parties, if they had the will, would have been on the ground, and they would have been, together with, we talk about being united and standing together and everything, but where were they when we really needed them on the ground? We now have a team of psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors who will be assisting those people that are traumatized. We've had children that where parents have complained that their children are not sleeping and so on. So now we've got that in place. So the DA is very much ahead of all the other parties in terms of these kinds of things. And hopefully, we're not doing it for the votes. We just completely, John said, completely no more canvassing, no more politics. We just want you people there to assist people. And I think that has been one of the things that has helped us a lot in terms of support. We found that a lot of Indian people who basically previously were not very supportive of us have come out in full support of us. But my main point at this stage is that I would like to know from the other political parties, where were you when our people needed you? Where were you when they were being traumatized? Where were you when their life earnings were decimated by a group of looters? And if you want to really work together, then you should consider all these things, before saying, commenting on the internal issues in the DA or any other party or anything else. We should focus on how we're going to be helping our people. And at this point in time, Rebuild KZN is something that we're focusing on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah, for such a well thought out delivery of the message from the DAs, and in terms of what they're currently doing in terms of building public trust, and also your thought-provoking ideas on what's currently happened in KwaZulu-Natal and how the government was caught in a particular instance whereby it was not even aware of what was going to happen, and particularly focusing on the security cluster whereby there has been a back and forth between the three different ministers, particularly focusing on some of the issues and in terms of what the state intelligence was supposed to do and how the government couldn't act in time for that, and as well as the president's admission that the government was quite unaware and was unprepared to deal with some of these fundamental issues, and as well as from the DA's perspective that there seemed to be no political willingness to address some of the violence that we are seeing and the looting that spread throughout KwaZulu Natal and Gauteng. So I would also like to give Mr. Msizi Khumalo an opportunity to respond based on a community perspective, because I know that he works with the Center for Community Development. And if we can hear maybe from Melusi's side as to what has been the Center for Community Development and Africa Unite doing in terms of helping or assisting through the spate of looting that has happened in KwaZulu-Natal, and how are they going to assist communities in terms of building trust between citizens and the political leadership. And if we recall, currently we also have particular issues whereby some people are calling it the Phoenix Massacre, and that on its own is bringing up certain racial tensions and the lack of trust within the South African police system as well as within political leaders, in that they are branded as people who are not willing to assist in bringing certain people to account for such issues. So I'm going to open it to Msizi Khumalo for now.
Okay, thanks, Isaac. It's Msizi Khumalo here from Center for Community Development. On our side as a civil society, of which our perspective, or maybe what we saw from the unrest, there was a lack of leadership, maybe, or on the side of government, and also a political will or on curbing also the violence or maybe the disruption that took place or on the unrest. As I also send on the chat box that asking a question, is politics the solution for now that we are looking up to, or is there any other way? Because it seems there was no leadership or that was present when the time the looting started. The government were nowhere to be seen. At where I reside in Umlazi, it's not even a kilometer or where the police station is, but there was a lot of looting that was taking place, of which maybe we heard on the media that the police weren't enough, they are not enough, but it seems there's this sense of maybe leaving people to fend for themselves. I'm not sure if it's the stance of the politicians or the stance of the politics system that we are in now, because this thing of looting ran about 3 days full, of which there was no interaction from the politics leadership side or the people on who were maybe the councillors also. They were nowhere to be seen, of which another thing said, or maybe the politicians or the councillors knew about the unrest that is going to take place, and then they were nowhere to be found, or maybe they've gone to hiding. We didn't know. And then the civil society came after the unrest that we need to clean up and we need to rebuild. We were busy involved in cleaning up our malls, our roads, as the civil society now, telling the people that it is important to take over or take charge of the spaces that they were living in. we are still battling for now to maybe encourage the society also to be trustful or maybe trusting of the system that we are in, also as we are also active in as an organization in civic education, on maybe making aware that people can be active citizens in their spaces, of which we are still going to do more, of which we saw that there is a need for civic education, so that the people can become active citizens. Thanks for now.
Yes, thank you so
Yes.
much, Msizi. Yes, thank you so much, Msizi, for giving us feedback based on the perspective of civil society, and also for sharing some of the most concerning news, particularly that has emerged in KwaZulu-Natal, particularly focusing on the unwillingness of the police cluster and as well as some of the political leaders in our communities to respond to the mayhem that we saw over the last week. But I think one important question then that arises is as to how do we then rebuild after this mayhem? How do we rebuild the confidence of businesses that they can operate in certain local spaces if there's going to be this particular mistrust between the government and the private sector in terms of really responding to some of the security concerns that are going to be raised? For example, how do we then ensure or assure businesses that such a mayhem will be dealt with in the near future in a manner that is going to ensure that we do not lose the number of jobs that are estimated to be 150,000 in KwaZulu-Natal alone? But I would like to hand back to Uspamandla for last. Yes, so I'd like to hand back to Uspamandla. I think he's available now. I'm going to hand back to Uspamandla so that he can capture, I think, the last comments from everyone, and then we can probably end the seminar. Thank you, Uspamandla.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khambule, for your expert facilitation. I know it was a slightly difficult one, given that some of the participants that we were expecting didn't end up coming through. But we have a message from Melissa, just to say that ACDP was on the ground, as she, the interim chair of eThekwini, has been busy working on communities, assisting whoever they can in whichever way that they can with food supplies, bread, milk, hot meals, etc. She also spoke about the Deputy President and member of Provincial Parliament, Pastor Wayne Tring, who came through to interact with communities that were affected by the unrest and are still reaching out to the affected areas and will continue to serve their constituencies in whichever way that they can. Thank you so much to both Shahana and Melissa for their participation, as well as our civil society organizations for their participation in this panel as well. We did have other political parties. We do have another political party in the room, but given that they arrived a bit late, they asked to sit this one out. But we do appreciate their support and participation as well. For the rounding up phase, I'd like to invite Mr. Kadima to go first, maybe a minute or so, just for your final thoughts in relation to our subject matter for today, and maybe how it might coincide with the unrest that has now dominated the second part of the conversation. And then Colette, your final thoughts in relation to any other thoughts that might have come up for you, or interacting with some of the chat section that might have come up as well. And then if Dr. Paul Kariuki would like to do the vote of thanks on, I know the program had not indicated as such, but if I might hijack him, given the nature of the conversation and the direction in which we've headed, to do our vote of thanks on behalf of the two organizations. The question that you've asked, Dr. Khambule, around the rebuilding process is a conversation that we're hoping to engage with in our session tomorrow that we'll be hosting from 12 to 2. The invite will be out shortly, but I think for the purposes of anyone who might be interested, my email address is brianb@ddp.org.za, and we welcome any questions that you might have in relation to that. Thanks. So I'd like to invite Commissioner Renier Scruman from the Commission for Religious and Linguistic Rights had also indicated that he has a question that he might want to ask. Before I move to Mr. Kadima, I'd like to invite Commissioner Renee Schuurman. If you have any questions for us that are still outstanding, please do go for it.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I must just say at the outset that this has been an exceptionally interesting morning, and I want to congratulate the organizers, Paul, and all of you. The way it's been done, it's been seamless, and I have really found it very, very
Thank you very much for that.
So also the fact that I can be here part of it as on behalf of the Commission, I'd like to express that view and that thank you as well. What I'd like to, I just want to do two things. I just want to touch on one statement that I want to share with you, and it was a statement that we made, our chairperson made recently, apropos all the violence and the difficulties, the very difficult period we've been through. And he said the following, and I really have a need to share it. He said, "We encourage our communities to be tolerant and resolved by peaceful means in alleviating the challenges that are facing them. We make a clarion call to cultural, religious, and linguistic communities," those are the ones that we serve as a commission, "to remain vigilant and continue to protect and promote the values of peace, friendship, unity, tolerance, and social cohesion." And I want to emphasize the social cohesion as espoused by the CRL Rights Commissioners Act of 2002. It is through these values that our communities will remain intact and face the challenges as a collective through peaceful means in order to build a society that continuously respects the dignity and well-being of others and create equal opportunities for all in pursuit of attaining a South Africa that is diverse and yet remaining one nation. That's the backdrop against which I'm just going to make the question. I want to just throw a question. Maybe it's unfair to come right at the end of everything and throw in a question, but I have had the need to be sharing it with you. And the question I formulated as follows: would it not be fair to say that unduly strident and aggressive political discourse can have the unintended consequence of harming the prospects of the growth and survival of social cohesion in a country like South Africa, which has a long and sad history of conflictual engagement and discourse? It's more, as you can see, moderator, it's more of a hypothetical question. So as a former politician for many years, 20 years in Parliament, I can't resist the temptation to still try and make my point. And my point is that social cohesion is under threat right now in this country, perhaps more than in a very long time. And we should be concerned with it. And that's why I'm so glad that there's been a constructive and good conversation about it this morning. And I want to congratulate you guys on doing that again, because I think it is helping the country. And I have already made my notes of which of the speeches I want to ask for specifically, because I'm going to share them with my fellow commissioners, 12 of us, and our chairperson, Professor David Musomo. And I want to go back and give them positive feedback about this opportunity. And just a last shot to Paul. He is a real dynamo, and I really appreciate everything that he is doing in this country as well. Thank you. My question is a hypothetical one, but if anybody wants to answer, that's okay.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Schuurman, for your participation, your support of the organization's work, as well as just the continued efforts to try and rebuild the social fabric of our country. I think it's more important now than it has been, for a while. So we really appreciate all of those efforts. Of course, we'd like to invite now Mr. Kadima, as well as Dr. Skulls Hesenberg, to give us their final thoughts. And perhaps if you're interested to hazard a response at the question from the Commissioner as well.
Oh, Brian, I just wanted to inform you, yeah, so Dr. Scott Zesenbeck has left. I think she had to attend something else.
Okay. I see her name here.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm still
I
here.
think she was waiting. I think she was waiting for Mr. Kadima to
Yes,
speak.
I was
Okay.
waiting for Denis.
Mr. Kadima. Okay, Colette, I think you can go for it, and then we'll have Paul to do the final rounding up and vote of thanks for us.
Thank you very much, Pamandla, and to your organization, to all the participants, to my co-speakers. I've found this equally as useful and fascinating and comforting, actually, after a very difficult few weeks. And I think I just want to make a couple of very brief points. Perhaps the big concern for all of us is bringing those of us who have disengaged from our political system back into electoral politics. And of course, there's no magic wand. I don't have a silver bullet. We're trying to figure out how we best do that. But what I can offer is that if it means that people have been disengaged because they've lost trust in democratic politics generally, that is something we really need to be deeply concerned about. And we now need to turn to those of us who take the public stage, whether we are election actors, electoral actors of any sort, politicians, political parties, the media, and we're all going to need to take a fair amount of responsibility in restoring public trust. And the way to do that, of course, is to be mindful of a few things. The first has been made abundantly clear by the Commissioner a moment ago, that we need to be mindful of how we exercise our political beliefs, our positioning around issues and politics in this country, given the fact that we do come from a very divided history and that our positioning can be abrasive for many. So we need mindful politicians that carry themselves with integrity and are willing to restore the public trust, are willing to be held accountable. And I think if we can embrace a public ethics kind of mentality, this will go a long way quite quickly to beginning to restore public trust. It's not all over. We can massage public trust back into shape. But I think what's also equally as important is that the actors that sit right at the middle of all of this are our political parties. We have a political system where candidates are important, and we certainly look at individuals, but political parties are the vehicles. And for that very reason, I would argue that, in fact, we need to start thinking about how they present themselves. And at the moment, there's a disjuncture. I think there's a misunderstanding amongst political parties about what voters read in order to make their decisions to participate, and then who to vote for. And there are three issues. The one is that as voters, we are always reading their performance. Can they show a track record of good performance in government? Second of all, we want to know that the issues and the policy platforms that they're putting forward are relevant to our lives. Are these political parties that we confront every day speaking to the issue of joblessness, employment creation, poverty and crime? And thirdly, we get a lot of information, what we call shortcut queued information from our political parties in terms of how they conduct themselves racially and in terms of who they represent. And there, I think opposition parties in particular have to work incredibly hard to pull together all of these three issues, their party and candidate images in terms of their representativity, their performance and their competence, but the issues that they speak to. And I often think that there's a disjuncture and an imbalance with these three issues. And voters are looking at this and trying to figure out where their interests are best addressed, and they're not always finding that resonance. And I just put that out there, not as a critique of our political parties, but as something that we need to begin to start to address in a very forward-thinking, progressive way. And I think this would go a long way to addressing the gap in the party system at the moment and bringing people back into the public space. And those are really my thoughts. And once again, just thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skulls-Hasenberg, and thank you so much for being willing to engage with us for the purposes of our summit. And we do hope to have you in some of our further engagements, given your very distinct analysis on the voter landscape in our country. We really do appreciate your time. Now, I'd like to offer an opportunity to Dr. Paul Kariuki to do the vote of thanks on behalf of the organization. And yeah. Dr. Kariuki.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. I really want to thank you for holding the space so ably, and to thank our speakers, some of whom have left. Dr. Colette, thank you so much again for your encouraging and insightful commentary that will help us to continue building on this work that we started today. In absentia, Mr. Simon Mamabolo, and I think Denis has also left. Thank you for all of them for helping us with their insights. And of course, Dr. Isaac Khambule, for all your ongoing support to the work of DDP. I can't forget also to thank our chairperson, Dr. David Rajab, who also made time to be part with us today, our former director, Dr. Rama Naidu, who had to leave again. But thank you again for your support and encouraging the work that we're doing. Your presence means a lot to us. And also to thank the political parties, those who are able to join us. We really thank you for taking your time off to come through. Commissioner Renier Skuman, thank you again for your ongoing support for our work, and we do take seriously the commentary around social cohesion, which is one of our upcoming conferences in September. So hopefully we're going to engage you even more together with the Commission on issues of around social cohesion, which have become very much critical at this point in time, given what we went through the last week. To our civil society partners, again, we thank you so much for your ongoing support, and we thank you for making time to be part of our conversation. We can't forget also to thank Christian for representing the foundation, Conrad and Noah Stiftung, on behalf of Mr. Henning Sewer. Thank you so much again for being there. And all other participants and delegates who are able to stay this long with us, we really do appreciate for being patient with us and also engaging actively on the chat box. Please look out on our upcoming events on our website, and we look forward to host you in the next coming ones. That we're going to do a lot more around these issues that have been raised here, especially as we prepare the citizenry towards voting. Although it might be now that the commission, the former DCJ has indicated the earliest could be February. We are waiting to see what the IEC will say, as Mr. Sai did indicate tomorrow in their report. And then we take it from there. But our work as an organization is ongoing, continuing to mobilize citizens to be conscious that their power lies in their vote, and mobilizing civil society to stand. The only way we can reclaim the power and our space to continue holding the government and our political leaders accountable. And we look forward to the next intervention, and we hope we're going to see you then. Thank you so much. We wish you well and have a very good afternoon. And thank you again to my colleagues, DDP team, that are also participated in making this event a success. Thank you so much, and be safe.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder that the recording of this will be available on our YouTube page in a few days. So if you missed it or want to refresh yourself on parts of the presentation, we will make sure to share that on our social media platforms. We will also make a plan to get the presentations from Mr. Mamabolo as well as Dr. Colette for any further engagement that you might want to have with their PowerPoint. Thank you so much to everyone, and thank you very much for your participation.